The following Monday arrived with a heavy downpour that left students rushing into the building, shaking off umbrellas and wiping raindrops from their jackets. Dr. Wilson arrived earlier than usual, his mind still occupied with questions about Grace Sullivan. He arranged his notes methodically at the front desk, occasionally glancing at the door. At precisely 9:25, 5 minutes before class was scheduled to begin, Grace walked in. Despite the rain, she looked perfectly composed, her silver hair neatly arranged, her clothes dry under a practical raincoat she was carefully folding. "Good morning, Dr. Wilson," she said with a warm smile as she took her seat in the front row. "Good morning. Mrs. Sullivan, Grace," he corrected himself. "I trust you had a productive weekend with the problem set?" She nodded, pulling out her notebook. "Oh yes, quite stimulating. Though I must admit the fifth problem gave me pause. I tried several approaches before finding one that worked." Dr. Wilson raised an eyebrow. The fifth problem was intentionally challenging, designed to stretch even his most talented students. Before he could respond, students began filing in, filling the room with the sound of conversation and movement. As the lecture began, Dr. Wilson found himself occasionally glancing at Grace. She took notes steadily, her pen moving across the page with practiced precision. When he introduced a particularly complex theorem, he noticed her nodding slightly, as if confirming something she already suspected. Halfway through the class, he decided to test his growing suspicions. "Let's work through a problem together," he announced, turning to the board. "This will help illustrate the practical application of what we've been discussing." He wrote out a differential equation that wasn't in the textbook, one that required creative application of several concepts they had covered over the past 2 weeks. It was the kind of problem that separated those who merely memorized formulas from those who truly understood the underlying principles. "Would anyone like to suggest where we might begin with this?" he asked, turning to face the class. The room fell silent. A few students flipped frantically through their notes, while others stared at the board with furrowed brows. Dr. Wilson let the silence stretch, knowing that sometimes discomfort preceded breakthrough. Finally, a hand went up, but not one of the usual hands. Grace sat with her arm raised, a slight hesitation in her expression as if she wasn't sure whether she should volunteer. Dr. Wilson felt a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Mrs. Sullivan, you have a suggestion?" Several students turned in their seats, watching as the elderly woman lowered her hand. "Well," she began, her voice soft but clear, "it seems to me that we could start by recognizing this as a non-homogeneous second-order equation. If we first find the complementary function using the auxiliary equation method, then find a particular integral." Dr. Wilson listened with growing amazement as Grace outlined a perfectly viable approach to the problem. Her explanation was methodical, clear, and demonstrated not just knowledge of the techniques but a deep understanding of why they worked. "That's correct," he said when she finished. "A very solid approach." He turned back to the board and began working through the problem using her suggested method, aware of the shift in energy in the room. The students were now watching Grace with new interest, whispering among themselves. As the class ended, Dr. Wilson made a decision. "Before you go," he announced, "I'd like to give you a challenge for Wednesday. Something a bit different." He quickly wrote a complex partial differential equation on the board, one that would typically appear in a graduate-level course. It involved multiple variables and required sophisticated techniques to solve. "This is optional, of course," he said, noting the groans from several students. "Consider it an intellectual exercise. We'll discuss possible approaches at the beginning of our next session." As students packed up and filed out, many casting wary glances at the intimidating equation left on the board, Dr. Wilson noticed Grace studying it intently. She copied it carefully into her notebook, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. "An interesting challenge," she commented as she gathered her things. "Indeed," Dr. Wilson replied. "I'm curious to see what approaches the class might come up with." What he didn't say was that he was primarily curious about her approach. The equation was deliberately beyond what he'd expect an undergraduate to solve. It would reveal the true extent of her mathematical ability, or its limits. "Have you encountered similar problems before?" he asked casually. Grace adjusted her glasses, looking back at the board. "Oh, it reminds me of something I read years ago in a journal. I can't recall which one now, my memory isn't what it used to be." She smiled apologetically. "But I'll certainly give it my best effort." As she left, Dr. Wilson remained at his desk, lost in thought. Her reference to a journal was interesting. This type of equation didn't appear in standard textbooks or popular science books. If she recognized it, she must have been reading academic mathematical journals, not typical leisure reading for someone who claimed to have no formal training in advanced mathematics. The next day, Dr. Wilson found himself in the university library, browsing through old mathematics journals. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly. Perhaps articles that might explain Grace's unexpected knowledge, or publications that she might have read. "Can I help you find something specific, Dr. Wilson?" asked Linda, the head librarian who had known him since he was a graduate student. "I'm just browsing," he said, then hesitated. "Actually, Linda, do you happen to know a Grace Sullivan?" An elderly woman, probably in her late 70s. Silver hair, blue eyes, usually carries a leather satchel. Linda's face brightened with recognition. "Grace, of course. She's been coming to the library for years, long before I started working here, and that was 20 years ago. She's practically a fixture in the mathematics section." "Really?" Dr. Wilson leaned against the counter, intrigued. "What does she typically read?" "Everything," Linda said with a laugh. "From basic textbooks to the most recent journals. I once found her comparing different translations of Euclid's Elements. For fun, she said she wanted to see how different translators interpreted the original Greek. But she never studied mathematics formally? Never taught it?" Linda shook her head. "Not that I know of. She mentioned once that she never had the opportunity to go to university. Family circumstances, I gathered. But her love for mathematics never diminished." Dr. Wilson thanked her and wandered back to the mathematics section, scanning the shelves thoughtfully. The image of Grace poring over mathematical texts for decades, teaching herself advanced concepts without formal guidance, was both impressive and slightly hard to believe. Could someone truly master such complex material through self-study alone? Wednesday's class arrived with a buzz of anticipation. Dr. Wilson noticed several students huddled together near the door, speaking in hushed tones and occasionally glancing toward the front row where Grace sat reviewing her notes. "Good morning, everyone," Dr. Wilson began, setting his briefcase down. "I hope you've had a chance to consider Monday's challenge problem." He turned to the board and rewrote the complex equation. "Would anyone like to share their thoughts on how to approach this?" The room was silent. He waited, scanning the faces of his students. Most avoided eye contact, staring down at their notebooks or suddenly finding their pencils fascinating. "No one," he prompted. "Not even a suggestion for a first step?" A hand went up in the back row. Thomas Chen, one of his more capable students, spoke hesitantly. "I tried using separation of variables, but I got stuck when the boundary conditions made the coefficients too complicated to determine." "A reasonable approach," Dr. Wilson nodded. "Anyone else?" Another student suggested a numerical approximation method, but admitted she couldn't get very far with it. A third mentioned attempting a power series solution, but getting lost in the algebra. Dr. Wilson listened to each attempt with patience, offering encouragement even as he noted that none had made significant progress. This wasn't surprising. The problem was deliberately beyond their current level. Finally, he turned to Grace, who had remained quiet throughout the discussion. "Mrs. Sullivan, did you have a chance to look at this problem?" All eyes turned to her. Grace looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention but nodded. "I did spend some time with it," she said. "It's quite an elegant problem." Dr. Wilson gestured toward the board. "Would you be willing to share your approach with the class?" A moment of hesitation crossed her face. "I'm not sure if my method is correct, but I'd be happy to show what I tried." She rose slowly from her seat, accepting the chalk Dr. Wilson offered. As she approached the board, he noticed a slight tremor in her hand, nervousness perhaps, or simply age. Yet when she began writing, her handwriting was clear and precise. "I recognize this as a special case of the heat equation with variable coefficients," she began, her voice gaining strength as she focused on the mathematics rather than the audience. "First, I made a substitution to transform it into a more standard form." The class watched in silent amazement as Grace worked through the problem step by step. Her approach was unconventional but elegant, drawing on techniques that Dr. Wilson typically covered in his graduate-level courses. She filled nearly half the board with careful derivations, occasionally pausing to check her work before continuing. There was no hesitation in her mathematics. Each step followed logically from the previous one, revealing a solution path of remarkable clarity. When she finished, she placed the chalk down and turned to face the class. I believe that addresses the key aspects of the problem, though there might be more elegant approaches I haven't considered. The room remained silent for several seconds before Dr. Wilson cleared his throat. That was... He searched for the right words. Masterful, Mrs. Sullivan. You've employed techniques typically covered in graduate-level analysis courses, and you've done so with remarkable precision. He turned to the class, whose expressions ranged from bewilderment to awe. This is precisely the kind of creative problem-solving that mathematics at this level requires. Mrs. Sullivan has demonstrated not just knowledge of formulas, but a deep understanding of the underlying principles. As Grace returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the classroom had shifted perceptibly. The students no longer viewed her as an oddity or an amusing presence. There was respect in their glances now, and genuine curiosity. Dr. Wilson spent the remainder of the class explaining the significance of the approach Grace had used, connecting it to the course material and expanding on the implications. But his mind was racing with questions. Who exactly was Grace Sullivan? And how had someone without formal training developed such sophisticated mathematical abilities? He was determined to find out. After Grace's impressive demonstration, the dynamics in the classroom shifted noticeably. Students who had previously paid little attention to the elderly woman now sought seats near her. Before class began, small clusters would form around her desk, asking questions about homework problems or concepts from the previous lecture. Grace answered each query with patience and clarity, often providing insights that made difficult concepts suddenly accessible. Dr. Wilson observed these interactions with growing curiosity. Her explanations were not just mathematically sound, but demonstrated a gift for teaching, an ability to translate complex ideas into simpler components that students could grasp. It was a skill that many professors with decades of experience never fully mastered. A week after the challenge problem, Dr. Wilson decided to take a different approach. Rather than testing Grace's abilities directly, perhaps he could learn more about her through casual conversation. He arrived at the lecture hall 30 minutes early, hoping to catch her before other students arrived. As he expected, Grace was already there, reviewing her notes from the previous class. "Good morning, Grace," he said, setting his briefcase on the desk. "You're early today." She looked up with a warm smile. "Good morning, Dr. Wilson. I'm always early. I find the quiet time before class helps me organize my thoughts." He nodded, pulling up a chair near her desk. "I wanted to thank you for your help with the students. I've noticed many of them coming to you with questions, and their understanding of the material seems to have improved." "Oh, it's nothing," she said, waving away the compliment. "They're bright young people. Sometimes they just need to hear something explained in a different way." "That's a rare gift," he said, "being able to explain complex concepts clearly. Did you ever teach professionally?" A shadow crossed her face so briefly he almost missed it. "No, not professionally. But I did help my husband with his work sometimes. And I tutored my children, of course." "Your husband was a mathematician?" Dr. Wilson asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Grace adjusted her glasses, her eyes taking on a distant look. "He was an engineer. Brilliant man. He worked for a large aerospace company back in the 1960s. Their team was involved in some of the early space program calculations." "That must have been fascinating work." "It was," she agreed. "Complex, demanding work. The margin for error was incredibly small. Robert would bring home problems sometimes, and we'd work on them together at the kitchen table after the children were asleep." She smiled at the memory. "Those were some of my happiest moments." "You helped with aerospace engineering calculations?" Dr. Wilson couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "Unofficially, yes." Her tone carried a hint of something, regret perhaps. Women weren't exactly welcomed in those technical departments back then, especially women without formal degrees. But Robert always valued my input. He said I had a knack for seeing patterns and solutions that others missed. Dr. Wilson leaned forward, intrigued. "But you never pursued mathematics formally yourself? Even after your children were grown?" Grace's hands folded in her lap, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. "By then, Robert was ill. Early onset Parkinson's. He needed care for nearly a decade before he passed. After that, I had grandchildren to help with. Life has a way of filling up with responsibilities. I'm sorry, Dr. Wilson said, genuinely moved by her matter-of-fact recounting of what must have been difficult years. Don't be, she replied with a gentle smile. I've had a good life, rich in many ways, and now I finally have time for this. She gestured around the classroom. Learning for the pure joy of it, students began trickling into the room, ending their private conversation. Dr. Wilson returned to his desk, his mind turning over what he had learned. There was more to Grace's story, he felt certain. The level of mathematical sophistication she displayed went beyond what one might pick up from helping with engineering calculations or self-study alone. As the week progressed, Dr. Wilson found himself paying closer attention to Grace's questions and comments during class. She never showed off her knowledge, but when she did speak, her insights often connected concepts in ways that revealed deep understanding. She seemed particularly adept at finding elegant solutions to complex problems, solutions that minimized calculation and maximized conceptual clarity. On Thursday afternoon, Dr. Wilson's office hours were interrupted by a knock on his door. He looked up to see Professor Huang, chair of the mathematics department, and his former mentor. Jim, do you have a moment? Professor Huang asked, closing the door behind him. Of course, what can I do for you? Professor Huang sat in the chair opposite Dr. Wilson's desk, his expression curious. I've been hearing interesting things about your advanced calculus class, specifically about an elderly woman who apparently solved a graduate-level PDE on the board. Dr. Wilson smiled. News traveled fast in academic circles. Grace Sullivan. She's auditing the class through the senior program. And yes, her mathematical abilities are unexpected. So I've heard. Thomas Chen is in both your class and my numerical methods seminar. He couldn't stop talking about it. Professor Huang leaned forward. Jim, he showed me her solution. It's remarkably similar to a technique published in the Journal of Mathematical Analysis about 20 years ago. A rather obscure paper that revolutionized approaches to certain classes of PDEs. Dr. Wilson frowned. She did mention reading mathematics journals. Perhaps she came across it? Perhaps. Professor Huang pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it on the desk. The paper was written by someone named G.S. Taylor. One paper, one significant contribution to the field, and then nothing else published under that name. G.S., Dr. Wilson repeated slowly. Grace Sullivan. The initials match, yes. But Taylor? She mentioned a husband. Taylor could be her maiden name. Professor Huang nodded thoughtfully. It would explain how she knew the technique so well. If she developed it herself, but why publish just one paper, and why under a different name? That, Professor Huang said, closing the folder, would be an interesting question to ask her. The next day, Dr. Wilson arrived at class with the journal article in his briefcase, uncertain how or if he should broach the subject with Grace. The decision was made for him when she approached his desk after class ended. Dr. Wilson, I was hoping I might trouble you for a recommendation, she said. The library has limited access to some of the more specialized mathematics journals. As a faculty member, you might be able to help me gain access. He looked up at her, momentarily caught off guard by the perfect opening. Actually, Grace, I've been meaning to ask you about something related to mathematics journals. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the folder. Are you familiar with this paper? She took the folder, opening it carefully. As she saw the title page, her expression changed subtly, a mixture of recognition and something else he couldn't quite identify. A novel approach to solving non-homogeneous partial differential equations with variable coefficients, she read aloud. By G.S. Taylor. She looked up, meeting his eyes. Where did you find this? Professor Huang brought it to my attention. The solution method you demonstrated last week bears a remarkable resemblance to the technique outlined in this paper. Grace was silent for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on the pages. It's been many years since I've seen this, she finally said, her voice soft. Grace, Dr. Wilson said gently, are you G.S. Taylor? She closed the folder carefully before answering. Yes, Grace Sullivan Taylor. That was my maiden name. Why just one paper? And why publish under a different name than the one you use now? Grace sat in the chair beside his desk, still holding the folder. It wasn't meant to be just one paper. I had several others in development. She smiled ruefully. But life intervened, as it often does. Robert's illness required more and more of my attention, and publishing under G.S. Taylor was simpler. Female mathematicians weren't always taken seriously then. Some reviewers would dismiss work once they realized a woman had written it. But this paper was significant. It advanced the field. Didn't you want recognition for that? She shook her head slightly. The mathematics was what mattered to me, not the recognition. I wanted the ideas to be judged on their merit alone. Dr. Wilson sat back, processing this revelation. You've continued your work, though, haven't you? Even if you haven't published. Mathematics has been my companion throughout my life, she confirmed. During Robert's illness, working on problems provided a kind of sanctuary. The beauty and logic of it was something I could rely on when everything else was uncertain. And now you're here. In my undergraduate class, Grace smiled, the warmth returning to her eyes. I wanted to fill in the gaps in my knowledge. Self-study is wonderful, but there's value in structured learning too. And she hesitated. I've missed being part of a mathematical community, even as just a student. Dr. Wilson looked at the elderly woman before him with new eyes. She had developed sophisticated mathematical techniques without formal training, published under a pen name to avoid prejudice, and set aside her own work to care for her family. And now in her 70s, she sat in his classroom, still hungry to learn more. Grace, he said, making a sudden decision, would you be interested in giving a guest lecture to my class about your approach to PDEs? I think the students would benefit enormously from hearing directly from you. Surprise flickered across her face. A lecture? Me? But I'm not a professor. No, he agreed. But you are a mathematician. One with a unique perspective and approach that could inspire these students. Grace was quiet for a moment, considering. I would need some time to prepare properly. Of course. How about next Friday? That would give you a week. A slow smile spread across her face, brightening her eyes in a way he hadn't seen before. I think I'd like that very much, Dr. Wilson. Thank you for the opportunity. As Grace left, carefully placing the journal article back in the folder to take with her, Dr. Wilson felt a profound shift in his perspective. He had entered teaching believing that knowledge flowed in predictable channels, from institutions to students, from professors to classrooms. Grace Sullivan had shown him that true mathematical insight could develop in unexpected places, nurtured by passion and persistence even when formal paths were closed. He was no longer just her teacher. In many ways, she had become his. News of Grace's upcoming guest lecture spread quickly through the mathematics department. What had begun as curious whispers about an elderly woman in Dr. Wilson's advanced class transformed into genuine academic interest. Several faculty members asked if they could attend, and graduate students from related fields requested permission to sit in. Dr. Wilson was surprised but pleased by the response. It seems you've become something of a celebrity in our department, he told Grace when she arrived for Monday's class. She looked momentarily alarmed. How many people are you expecting on Friday? Don't worry, he assured her. The regular classroom will be fine. Maybe 30 people total, including our usual students. Grace nodded, though he could see a new nervousness in her movements as she arranged her notes and textbook. Second thoughts? He asked gently. She smiled, a touch of determination entering her expression. No, just the usual stage fright. It's been a very long time since I've spoken in front of a group. You'll be wonderful, he said, and was surprised to realize how sincerely he meant it. Throughout the week, Dr. Wilson noticed Grace staying after class, working quietly in the corner of the room, making notes and occasionally consulting the textbook. On Wednesday, he found her in the library, surrounded by mathematical journals and reference books. Preparing for Friday? He asked, pulling up a chair at her table. She looked up, slightly startled. Yes, I want to make sure I'm presenting things clearly. These young people deserve my best effort. He glanced at her notes, pages of careful derivations and explanations, with annotations in the margins highlighting potential questions or areas that might need more detailed explanation. You're being very thorough. Mathematics requires precision, she replied with a small smile, and I find I'm a bit rusty at organizing material for others. When you work alone for decades, you develop shortcuts in your thinking that don't translate well to teaching. If you'd like, I'd be happy to look over your notes, offer suggestions. Grace considered this for a moment, then shook her head. Thank you, but I think I need to do this my way. It's important to me. He nodded, understanding. This wasn't just a lecture for her, it was a debut of sorts. a public acknowledgement of work and passion she had kept private for most of her life. Friday morning arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp air, bright sunshine, and trees beginning to show hints of gold and crimson. Dr. Wilson arrived early to find the classroom already filling with visitors. Professor Huang was there, along with several other faculty members from the mathematics department. Graduate students clustered in the back rows, notebooks open and ready. When Grace walked in, conversation momentarily paused as people turned to look at her. She hesitated in the doorway, clearly surprised by the larger-than-expected audience. Dr. Wilson quickly went to greet her. "I may have underestimated the interest," he admitted quietly. Grace took a deep breath, clutching her notes a bit tighter. "Well, I suppose it's too late to run away now." He smiled at the joke, relieved to see her sense of humor intact despite the pressure. "Would you like me to introduce you, or would you prefer to begin on your own?" "An introduction might help," she said. "Give me a moment to collect my thoughts." Dr. Wilson nodded and moved to the front of the room as Grace took a seat in the front row, reviewing her notes one last time. At exactly 9:30, he called the class to order. The room quieted immediately, an unusual level of attention for a Friday morning. "Good morning, everyone. As you know, today's class will feature a special guest lecture from Grace Sullivan, who has been auditing this course through the university's Senior Citizen Program. What many of you may not know is that Mrs. Sullivan is also G.S. Taylor, author of a groundbreaking paper on solutions to non-homogeneous partial differential equations published some 20 years ago. A murmur of interest ran through the room, particularly among the visiting faculty. Her work introduced innovative techniques that many of us have taught without knowing their origin. Today, she'll be sharing her approach to these problems and the insights that led to her discoveries. Please join me in welcoming Grace Sullivan. The room filled with warm applause as Grace made her way to the front, her notes held carefully in slightly trembling hands. She set them on the desk, adjusted her glasses, and looked out at the audience. For a moment, she said nothing, and Dr. Wilson felt a flash of concern. But then she straightened her shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and confident. "Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I must admit I never expected to be standing here at this point in my life." She smiled, and something in her open sincerity seemed to connect immediately with the audience. "Mathematics has been my lifelong companion, though often a secret one. Today I'd like to share with you not just a technique for solving certain equations, but the journey that led me to discover it." She turned to the board and began writing, explaining as she went. "Let's start with a problem that appears unsolvable using conventional methods." Dr. Wilson took a seat, becoming just another student as Grace's lecture unfolded. Her teaching style was unique, a blend of rigorous mathematics and intuitive explanations, frequently illuminated by practical examples from engineering and physics. She had a gift for making complex ideas accessible without oversimplifying them, maintaining the elegant heart of the mathematics while building bridges to understanding. "The key insight," she explained about halfway through her talk, "came to me while I was washing dishes. Of all things." This drew a gentle laugh from the audience. "I was thinking about fluid flow patterns as the water spiraled down the drain. Sometimes the most profound mathematical insights come from observing the world around us." As she continued, Dr. Wilson noticed the graduate students taking detailed notes, and several of his colleagues nodding with expressions of growing respect. Even the undergraduate students seemed engaged, following along with greater comprehension than he had expected. Grace concluded with a simple but powerful demonstration, solving a problem that typically required pages of calculations in just a few elegant steps using her method. "Mathematics, at its best, reveals the hidden simplicities within apparent complexity," she said, setting down the chalk. "Thank you for allowing me to share this journey with you today." The applause that followed was enthusiastic and genuine. Students and faculty alike stood, offering her a standing ovation that brought a flush of surprise and pleasure to her face. As people came forward to ask questions and offer congratulations, Dr. Wilson hung back, watching the scene with a sense of profound satisfaction. Professor Huang approached him, shaking his head in amazement. "Remarkable," he said. "Absolutely remarkable. Do you know she extended her original work? Those final examples weren't in her published paper. She's continued developing the theory all these years." "Without publishing?" Dr. Wilson asked. Professor Huang nodded. A loss to the field, but perhaps not for much longer. He glanced at Grace, who was deep in conversation with two graduate students. I'm going to speak with her about the possibility of publishing her recent work. The department would be happy to provide support. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Grace finally made her way back to Dr. Wilson, her eyes bright with excitement. That was, she began, then shook her head, seemingly at a loss for words. Brilliant, he finished for her. You were brilliant, Grace. It felt good, she admitted. To share these ideas, to see people engage with them. I'd forgotten what that was like. Professor Huang wants to talk to you about publishing your recent work. Her eyes widened slightly. Really, at my age? Mathematics doesn't care about age, Dr. Wilson said, echoing what she had demonstrated through her presence in his class. Only about truth and beauty. Grace smiled, gathering her notes. Truth and beauty, she repeated softly. Yes, that's always been what drew me to it. As they walked together toward the department lounge where a small reception had been arranged in her honor, Dr. Wilson felt compelled to ask the question that had been on his mind. Do you have regrets, Grace, about not pursuing mathematics professionally? She considered this for a long moment. I used to, she finally said. When the children were young and I was solving problems in stolen moments at the kitchen table. When I would read journals and think, I could contribute to this conversation. They paused in the hallway, standing beside a window that overlooked the campus quad, where students hurried between classes under the autumn trees. But life gives us different paths, different kinds of contributions to make, she continued. I raised 3 wonderful children. I supported my husband through his career and his illness, and through it all I kept this love of mathematics alive in my heart. She turned to him with a serene smile. No, James, I don't regret the path I took. I'm just grateful that it finally led me here. As they continued walking, Dr. Wilson reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought Grace Sullivan into his classroom. What had begun as irritation at an unexpected interruption had become one of the most profound learning experiences of his career, not just about mathematics, but about assumptions, persistence, and the unexpected forms that genius could take. You know, he said as they approached the lounge, where faculty and students waited to continue the conversation her lecture had started. You've changed how I think about teaching, have I? She asked, genuinely curious. You've reminded me to look for understanding wherever it might appear. Even, he smiled, acknowledging his own initial bias, in the front row from someone I never expected to learn from. Grace laughed, a sound of pure delight. Well, Professor Wilson, it seems we've both learned something this semester. Together, they entered the room where a new chapter in Grace's mathematical journey and Dr. Wilson's teaching career was about to begin. The weeks following, Grace's guest lecture brought a whirlwind of changes to both her life and the mathematics department. Professor Huang had not only encouraged her to publish her recent work, but had also arranged for her to have access to a small office in the mathematics building, a courtesy typically reserved for visiting scholars. It's just a converted storage room, he explained as he showed her the space. But it has a desk, some bookshelves, and most importantly, peace and quiet. Grace ran her hand along the simple wooden desk, her eyes bright with emotion. My whole life I've worked at kitchen tables and in library corners. This is more than generous. It's well-deserved, Professor Huang replied, and selfishly we're hoping proximity might encourage more of your mathematical insights to find their way into our journals. Grace had accepted the offer with deep gratitude. Dr. Wilson would often see her there in the afternoons, surrounded by papers, working steadily with the same focused concentration she brought to his class. By mid-November, Grace had become an unofficial but valued presence in the department. Graduate students would seek her out for her unique perspective on difficult problems. Several faculty members had begun regular discussions with her, exploring how her methods might apply to their own research areas. Even the department's weekly colloquium had been enriched by her thoughtful questions and observations. Dr. Wilson observed these developments with quiet satisfaction. He had watched as Grace transitioned from an oddity in his classroom to a respected member of their mathematical community. More importantly, he had seen how her presence changed the department's culture in subtle but significant ways. On a cold Tuesday in late November, Dr. Wilson was leaving his office when he noticed the light still on in Grace's room. He knocked gently on the half-open door. "Still working?" he asked, finding her at her desk. Papers spread across the surface. She looked up with a smile. "Just finishing some notes. Professor Hernandez asked me to look at his approach to a boundary value problem. He's coming up with similar results to mine, but through a different method." Dr. Wilson leaned against the doorframe. "Collaboration suits you." "It does," she agreed, setting down her pen. "All these years, I've been having these one-sided conversations with authors in journals. It's wonderful to finally have them talk back." He smiled at the image. "I wanted to let you know that the end-of-semester meeting is next week. We'll be discussing spring courses." "Already? The semester has gone by so quickly." "Time flies when you're revolutionizing a mathematics department," he joked. Then more seriously, "I'd like to propose something if you're open to it." Grace looked at him expectantly. "How would you feel about co-teaching a special topics course with me next semester? On non-standard approaches to differential equations." Her eyes widened. "Co-teaching? But I don't have a degree. I'm not qualified on paper. The department can appoint you as a visiting lecturer based on your publication and expertise. Professor Huang has already approved the idea, if you're interested." Grace was silent for a moment, her fingers absently tracing patterns on her desk as she considered the offer. "Teaching," she said finally. "Not just one guest lecture, but a whole course." "You'd be excellent at it," Dr. Wilson said. "You have a gift for explanation that many career academics never develop. And your perspective would be invaluable to the students." "What would this course look like?" she asked, and he could hear the mixture of excitement and apprehension in her voice. "That's the best part. We'd design it together. Your practical intuition combined with formal theory. I'm thinking a small seminar, 15 students maximum, graduate level." Grace stood up and walked to the small window in her office, looking out at the campus now decorated with twinkling winter lights. "When I walked into your classroom that first day, I never imagined something like this," she said softly. "Neither did I," Dr. Wilson admitted with a laugh. "I thought you were lost." She turned back to him with a warm smile. "Perhaps I was, in a way, just not in the way you thought." The final day of the fall semester arrived with a light snowfall that dusted the campus in white. Dr. Wilson's advanced. Calculus class had their last session scheduled for the morning, with final exams to follow the next week. As students filtered into the classroom, Dr. Wilson noticed a different energy than usual. There were whispers and glances toward the front of the room, where an elegant arrangement of flowers sat on Grace's desk alongside a card bearing multiple signatures. Grace arrived right on time, looking surprised at the floral display. "What's this?" Thomas Chen, who had emerged as an unofficial spokesperson for the class, stood up. "It's a thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, from all of us, for everything you've taught us this semester." "But I wasn't the teacher," she protested gently. "You taught us plenty," another student chimed in. "And not just about math." Dr. Wilson stepped forward. "Class, before we wrap up the semester, I have an announcement." He gestured for Grace to join him at the front. "Next spring, Mrs. Sullivan will be co-teaching a special topics course with me on non-standard approaches to differential equations. For those of you continuing to graduate studies, you might want to consider it." Excited murmurs filled the room. Thomas raised his hand. "Can undergrads petition to join?" "We'll consider exceptional cases," Dr. Wilson replied with a smile. "Now let's finish our final topic before you all disappear for winter break." As the lecture proceeded, Dr. Wilson found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey of the semester. He had begun with his usual structured approach, confident in his role as the expert at the front of the room. Grace's arrival had disrupted that comfortable pattern, challenging his assumptions not just about who could understand advanced mathematics, but about how learning and teaching could intertwine in unexpected ways. After class ended and the students had filed out, Grace lingered, her flower arrangement carefully wrapped to protect it from the snow outside. "You've created quite a stir in my department," Dr. Wilson said, gathering his materials. "Professor Huang mentioned that several other universities have reached out about your work since the preprint of your new paper was circulated." "It's still hard to believe," she admitted. "After so many years of working in isolation, to suddenly have all this interest?" She shook her head in wonder. "You deserve it," he said simply. "Your work is brilliant. It always was. Grace looked around the empty classroom, her expression thoughtful. I keep thinking about that first day, when you were so certain I didn't belong here. One of my more fortunate mistakes, Dr. Wilson acknowledged with a rueful smile. It taught me an important lesson about assumptions. We all make them, Grace said kindly. The important thing is what we do after we realize they're wrong. They walked together to the door, pausing as Dr. Wilson turned off the lights for the last time that semester. Will you miss being a student? He asked. Grace's eyes twinkled with humor. I'll always be a student, James. That never changes. But I admit I'm looking forward to trying my hand at this teaching business. I have some ideas about how to make those partial differential equations less intimidating for the newcomers. The spring semester began with record enrollment requests for the special topics course co-taught by Professor Wilson and visiting lecturer Sullivan. What had been planned as a small seminar had to be moved to a larger classroom to accommodate the interest, though they still maintained a selective admissions process to keep the class size manageable. On the first day, Dr. Wilson arrived early to find Grace already at the front of the room, arranging her notes and checking the displays for the interactive demonstrations they had prepared. Nervous? He asked, setting his briefcase down beside the desk they would share. A little, she admitted, but the good kind of nervous, like standing at the edge of something exciting. When the students arrived, a mix of graduate students, a few exceptional undergraduates who had successfully petitioned, and even a couple of faculty members from related departments, Grace and Dr. Wilson began the class together, alternating as they introduced the course objectives and approach. Watching Grace address the room with growing confidence, Dr. Wilson felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged, not just as a student or a hidden genius working in isolation, but as an active participant in the ongoing conversation of mathematics. Her journey from the woman who hesitantly entered his classroom to the colleague standing beside him embodied the best of what education could be: a continual process of discovery, growth, and shared understanding. As the semester progressed, word spread beyond the university about the unique course and its remarkable co-teacher. A mathematics education journal requested an interview with Grace. Several prominent universities expressed interest in having her give talks. By spring break, she had received an invitation to present at an international conference on differential equations. Will you go? Dr. Wilson asked when she showed him the invitation. Grace's smile held a new confidence. Yes, I think I will. It's time to share these ideas more widely. They'll be impressed, he assured her. Just as we were, she shook her head slightly. You know what I've realized, James? The most valuable thing isn't impressing people. It's connecting with them, finding those moments when a shared understanding clicks into place. He nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. It was precisely that connection that had transformed his own approach to teaching over the past months. The students are the ones who benefit most from all this, Grace continued, gesturing toward the classroom where their joint course met. They're seeing that mathematics isn't just about what's in the textbooks. It's about curiosity and persistence and looking at problems from unexpected angles. And they're learning that insight can come from anywhere, Dr. Wilson added. Even from an unexpected visitor in the front row. Grace laughed, the sound full and joyous. Especially from there, perhaps. Together, they walked toward the lecture hall, ready to continue the journey they had begun that fall day, when a teacher had challenged an elderly woman to solve a complex equation, and found himself learning the most important lesson of all.